a law that made it illegal for a black woman to show her hair in public. A test so deliberately impossible that even lawyers failed it, given only to black voters. Towns with signs that said, "If you're black, be gone by sundown." Or else, a law making it a criminal offense to teach an enslaved person to read a single word. Separate ambulances. One for white patients, one for black patients. And if the black one was busy, you waited on the pavement and hoped you survived. Laws that made it illegal to dance with someone of a different race. Laws that made it illegal to marry them. Laws that charged you a fee to vote, and then made sure your grandfather's slave status meant you'd never be exempt from paying it. You might think I'm describing some dystopian fiction, or some backwater country you've never heard of. I'm describing the United States of America. Today on Hidden Black Files, we are going through 10 real laws. Laws that were written, signed, enforced, and in some cases celebrated, that targeted black Americans with a precision and creativity that would be almost impressive if it weren't so monstrous. Some of these you may have heard of. Most of them, I'd be willing to bet, were not in your school curriculum. And all of them, every single one, have a shadow that stretches into the present day. This is the history they didn't teach you. Let's get into it. If you're new here, subscribe right now. We put out a new Black History documentary every week, covering stories exactly like this one. Now let's go. Let's start with a law that targeted something deeply, personally, and beautifully. Black hair. New Orleans, 1786. The city is under Spanish colonial rule, governed by a man named Don Esteban Miro. And Miro has a problem. The problem, as he sees it, is that free black women in New Orleans are becoming too visible, too fashionable, too beautiful, and that beauty is attracting attention, including, reportedly, the attention of white men. His solution was the Tignon laws. Under these laws, Creole women of color were required, by law, to cover their hair with a tignon, a scarf, a handkerchief, any fabric that would conceal what Miro and the colonial establishment considered a dangerously attractive feature. These women were becoming, quote, too light-skinned, too elegantly dressed, too much of a social threat to a hierarchy built on the premise that black meant inferior. Historian Virginia M. Gould documented how the Tignon laws were a direct response to the rising social presence of free black women in New Orleans. Women who were building lives, building influence, and dressing in ways that defied the social order designed to diminish them. Cover your hair. Know your place. Stay inferior. But here's what happened, and this is the part that should make you smile, even as it makes you furious. The women of New Orleans refused to be diminished. They took the Tignon, and they made it extraordinary. Using silks, jewels, intricate knotting techniques, decorative pins, and elaborate folds, black women transformed the government-mandated head covering into one of the most striking fashion statements in New Orleans history. What was designed as a mark of subordination became a declaration of sovereignty. The Tignon became so fashionable that white women began imitating it. The government tried to make her invisible. She made herself unforgettable. The Tignon laws were abandoned after the United States acquired Louisiana in 1803. But the cultural practice they tried to suppress, the celebration of black hair as an art form, a statement, an identity, never died. It evolved. It traveled. Today it lives in every lock, every braid, every natural crown that black women wear with pride. And notably, workplace discrimination against natural black hairstyles persisted into the 21st century. The Crown Act, creating a respectful and open world for natural hair, was introduced federally in 2019, specifically because black women were still being fired, disciplined, and rejected for wearing their hair naturally. The ghost of Don Miro's law was still haunting people over 2 centuries later. Before we explain this one, I want you to try something. Read the following question. You have 10 seconds to answer it correctly. How'd you do? That question, that exact question, was on the Louisiana literacy test, a test given to black residents who wanted to vote. 30 questions like that. 10 minutes total. Miss a single one. 1 out of 30, and you failed the entire test. No second attempt. No appeal. No vote. And these tests weren't administered fairly, even when someone knew the material. There was a reading comprehension section where a black voter would read a passage from the state constitution aloud in front of a white jury. Any mispronunciation, any stumble, any hesitation, the jury could fail you on the spot for any reason they chose, or no reason at all. Now look at what that test looked like, depending on your race. The passage given to white voters: no person shall be imprisoned for debt. The passage given to black voters: the income arising from the 16th Section Trust Fund, the Surplus Revenue Fund, until called for by the United States government, and the funds enumerated in Sections 257 and 258 of the Constitution. One sentence for white voters. A paragraph of dense constitutional legalese for black voters, in front of a jury that could fail you for breathing wrong. The literacy test wasn't a measure of education. It was theater. Theater designed to create the illusion of a fair process while delivering a predetermined result. Black people don't vote. And it worked. In parish after parish across Louisiana, voter registration data shows black populations that, despite outnumbering white residents in some areas, showed voter registration and turnout rates that were decimated by these tests. Communities with thousands of eligible black voters reduced to dozens of actual registrations. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally banned literacy tests federally. But by then, they had disenfranchised generations. Even if a black voter survived the literacy test gauntlet, they weren't done yet. Because there was a fee. The poll tax was exactly what it sounds like. You had to pay to vote. In many states, the amount was roughly $6, somewhere around $60 in today's money. For most white working-class families, that was manageable. For black Southerners, many of whom were trapped in exploitative sharecropping arrangements specifically designed to keep them in permanent debt, it was often simply impossible. But the cruelty of the poll tax didn't stop at the price tag. The taxes were cumulative. If you missed voting for 5 years because you couldn't afford it, or because you were prevented by other means, you owed 5 years of back taxes before you could cast a single vote. In Georgia, men aged 21 to 60 were required to pay for every year they had been of voting age. Show up for the first time at 40 years old, and you owed nearly 2 decades of back taxes. And then, hidden in the fine print, the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause stated that anyone whose grandfather had previously voted without paying the poll tax was exempt from paying it now. It sounds neutral. It wasn't. Before the Civil War, free white men voted without paying any such tax. Enslaved black people were not permitted to vote at all, which meant that the grandfather clause by design benefited only white voters whose grandfathers had exercised a right that black grandfathers were legally prohibited from having. They built a trap, then they gave white families the key, then they called it democracy. The 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax in federal elections in 1964. The Supreme Court eliminated it from state elections in 1966, in Harper versus Virginia State Board of Elections. But by that point, the poll tax had been operational for over 60 years. 60 years of purchasing white political dominance with a $6 fee. Picture this. You've been in an accident. You are bleeding. You cannot move. Someone has called for help. An ambulance arrives. It does not stop for you. It stops for the white man lying a few feet away. It loads him in, closes the doors, and drives away. You wait. You hope there's another ambulance coming. You hope it comes in time. In several American cities, this was not a nightmare. It was policy. Racially segregated ambulance services maintained separate vehicles for black and white patients. In cities like Pittsburgh, black residents were often served, if served is the right word, by auxiliary police vehicles repurposed as ambulances, staffed by personnel with minimal medical training. Longer wait times, worse care, and in far too many cases, preventable deaths. In 1967, a physician named Peter Safar, working in Pittsburgh, decided this was unacceptable. He co-founded the Freedom House Ambulance Service, the first emergency medical service in the United States, staffed entirely by black paramedics. These men and women received rigorous training that, at the time, didn't exist in standardized form anywhere in the country. They helped invent modern pre-hospital care protocols in the process. The results were immediate and staggering. In its first year of operation, Freedom House recorded response times of under 10 minutes across Pittsburgh's most underserved neighborhoods. It saved over 200 lives in 12 months. 200 lives in 1 year. From a service that only existed because the official system had decided those lives weren't worth saving. Freedom House was shut down in 1975. Political opposition. Funding cuts. A restructured citywide service that employed predominantly white personnel. The people who had proven the model was possible were pushed out of the system they had built. But the protocols Freedom House developed, the training standards, the paramedic certification model, the emphasis on pre-hospital intervention, were adopted nationally. The American emergency medical system, as it exists today, was shaped in significant part by the innovations of a black-staffed ambulance service that the city of Pittsburgh eventually decided it didn't need. If this history is hitting you the way it's hitting me, share this video right now. One share gets this story to someone who's never heard it. That matters more than you know. Now let's keep going. We're only halfway through. You're driving through the American Midwest. It's late afternoon. You need somewhere to sleep for the night. You pull into the nearest town. And there's a sign, "Nigger, don't let the sun go down on you here." Sundown towns were municipalities. Entire towns, sometimes entire counties, where Black Americans were explicitly prohibited from remaining after dark. The term comes from those signs, which were posted at town borders, sometimes in store windows, sometimes painted on walls. The message was unmistakable. You may pass through during daylight hours. After sunset, your presence is a crime. After sunset, we cannot guarantee your safety. After sunset, you may not survive. The consequences for violating these unspoken, and sometimes very spoken, laws ranged from harassment to arrest to murder. Lynching was not a rare outcome for Black individuals caught in sundown towns after dark. And here is what most people don't know about sundown towns. They were not a Southern phenomenon. They were everywhere. James Loewen, the historian who spent years documenting them in his landmark book Sundown Towns, identified thousands of these communities across the United States, in Illinois, in Indiana, in Ohio, in Oregon, in California. Suburban towns, commuter towns, some of the most respectable communities in America. The sign might have said welcome. What it meant was, not you. The practical impact on Black travel was profound. Planning a road trip across America, something white families took for granted, required a Black family to map out not just routes, but safe zones. Where could they stop for gas? For food? For a bathroom? Where could they sleep without risking their lives? Victor Hugo Green answered that question. Beginning in 1936, the New York postal worker published the Negro Motorist Green Book annually, a guide to Black-friendly businesses, hotels, and restaurants across the country. It was called, without irony, the Bible of Black Travel. It wasn't a novelty. It was a survival manual. The Green Book ceased publication in 1966, when its mission was theoretically accomplished by the Civil Rights Act. But many of the towns that were documented sundown towns in 1960 are still overwhelmingly white today. The legal basis for exclusion is gone. The demographic result of decades of exclusion remains. Why would anyone make it illegal to read? The answer is simple and terrifying. Because knowledge is power. And those who benefit from the powerlessness of others will do anything to preserve it. South Carolina passed the first anti-literacy law in 1739 as an addendum to their Negro Act, making it a criminal offense to teach an enslaved person to read or write. Georgia followed. Louisiana followed. Virginia followed. By the eve of the Civil War, teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal in most of the American South. In 1845, James Henry Hammond, governor of South Carolina, senator, and unabashed defender of slavery, wrote a letter to British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson. In it, he explained the reasoning with brutal clarity. "You want to allow our slaves to read your writings, stimulating them to cut our throats. Can you believe us to be such unspeakable fools?" There it is. In his own words. We must keep them from reading, Because if they could read, they would understand their situation. And if they understood their situation, they would fight to change it. The laws became even harsher after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, when an enslaved man in Virginia, who had, in fact, learned to read, organized the deadliest slave revolt in American history. 60 white people were killed. The response was not reflection. The response was terror, mass executions, new restrictions, and a redoubling of the anti-literacy laws. They were not afraid of black people reading novels. They were afraid of black people reading the Declaration of Independence and believing it applied to them. And yet, people found a way. Frederick Douglass, who would become the most powerful abolitionist voice of the 19th century, learned to read as a child in Maryland by befriending white neighborhood children and trading bread for reading lessons. He hid what he knew. He practiced in secret. He read whatever he could find, including the U.S. Constitution, including the Bible, including abolitionist pamphlets. And then there was John Berry Meacham, a free black minister in Missouri, who discovered that his state's anti-literacy laws applied only to Missouri soil. His solution was extraordinary. He built a school on a steamboat, anchored it in the middle of the Mississippi River, which was federal territory, and taught black children to read in the middle of the water, technically beyond the reach of Missouri law. By the time the Civil War ended, only 5% to 10% of enslaved African Americans were literate. Every one of them had committed an act of resistance simply by knowing how to read their own name. If you think segregation stopped at schools and buses, think again. It reached into the most human spaces imaginable: music, dancing, and joy. In the 1950s, a member of the Flamingos, one of the most beloved doo-wop groups of the era, recalled a performance where police officers were stationed at the edge of the stage with a specific assignment: make sure the singers did not make eye contact with any white audience members. Not direct eye contact. At a concert, while singing, the Flamingos had to perform looking at the floor, or at the ceiling, or at each other, because eye contact between a black performer and a white fan was considered a social violation serious enough to require law enforcement supervision. Many venues maintained physical barriers, ropes, painted lines, separate sections, dividing black and white audiences at the same concert. The music could be shared. The space could not. As rock and roll exploded in the 1950s, this became increasingly difficult to enforce. Rock and roll was, at its core, the sound of black musical tradition, R&B, gospel, blues, filtered through a new energy that young white audiences found irresistible. Segregationists understood the threat. If white teenagers were dancing to black music, the cultural wall between the races was crumbling. Some cities banned interracial dancing outright. Some venues were raided when integrated audiences formed organically. Some musicians had their concerts shut down mid-performance because the audience didn't look the way authorities wanted it to. Ray Charles, who by the early 1960s was one of the most famous musicians on earth, canceled a concert in Augusta, Georgia, rather than perform for a segregated audience. He was fined and banned from the state for a year. He considered it worth it. They tried to separate the music from the people who made it. It didn't work. It never works. But they tried. The International Sweethearts of Rhythm, an interracial all-female jazz orchestra that performed in the 1940s, traveled in a bus with the curtains drawn so that local authorities couldn't see that white and black women were sitting together. When they arrived in some towns, they were turned away entirely. Not because of their music, because of their existence. The next time you hear someone complain about political musicians, remember, black artists were once legally prohibited from performing without police supervision. The political music came before the politics. The politics were imposed on them. Richard Loving was a white bricklayer from Caroline County, Virginia. Mildred Jeter was a black woman from the same county. They grew up together. They fell in love. In 1958, they drove to Washington, D.C. to get married, because in Virginia, their marriage was a criminal offense. They came home. They hung their marriage certificate on the wall. And in the middle of the night, police broke into their home, arrested them both in their bedroom, and charged them under Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which made marriage between white and non-white people a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The judge who sentenced them offered a deal: leave Virginia for 25 years or go to prison. They left, and then, after years of exile from the state where they were born, they filed suit. In 1967, Loving versus Virginia reached the Supreme Court. The decision was unanimous, 9-0. Chief Justice Earl Warren, writing for the court, declared that the freedom to marry is a fundamental right inherent to the concept of ordered liberty, and that it cannot be restricted based on race. Anti-miscegenation laws violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The government had made love a crime. 9 Supreme Court justices said, no more. At the time of the ruling, 16 states still had anti-miscegenation laws on their books. Not 16 small towns, 16 states, 1/3 of the country. The Lovings didn't live to see everything their case enabled. Richard was killed by a drunk driver in 1975. But Mildred lived to see the 2015 Supreme Court ruling in Obergefell versus Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. The legal arguments that struck down bans on interracial marriage were directly cited in striking down bans on same-sex marriage. The Lovings' courage created a precedent that extended far beyond what even they could have imagined. Mildred Loving, when asked about it, said simply, "I believe all Americans, no matter their race, no matter their sex, no matter their sexual orientation, should have that same freedom to marry." We touched on the grandfather clause earlier in the context of poll taxes. But it deserves its own examination, because as a piece of political engineering designed to permanently disadvantage black voters while maintaining legal deniability, it was genuinely brilliant in its evil. Following Reconstruction, Southern states were required, at least nominally, to allow black men to vote. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. They couldn't simply write no black voters into their constitutions. They needed another approach. The grandfather clause was that approach. Louisiana passed its version in 1898. It stated that any man who had been registered to vote before January 1, 1867, or whose father or grandfather had been registered by that date, was permanently exempt from all new voter registration requirements, literacy tests, poll taxes, property requirements. Before January 1, 1867, black men in the South could not legally vote, which meant that the grandfather clause, while technically race-neutral in its language, was perfectly calibrated to benefit only white voters, whose fathers and grandfathers had exercised rights that were categorically denied to black fathers and grandfathers. It didn't say white only. It didn't have to. It said grandfather, and that was enough. The Supreme Court struck down grandfather clauses in 1915 in Gwynne versus United States. But by then, voter rolls across the South had been restructured so comprehensively that the demographic damage was baked in. Removing the grandfather clause didn't restore the registrations that had never been allowed to happen. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery in the United States. It is one of the most celebrated documents in American history. It also contains a loophole. The 13th Amendment reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." Except as a punishment for crime. The day the Civil War ended, Southern states began exploiting that exception with extraordinary speed and creativity. New laws, collectively known as black codes, were passed that made it a criminal offense for black people to be unemployed, to be vagrants, to fail to carry proof of employment, to gather in groups, to be out after curfew, to speak insolently to a white person. These laws had no meaningful definition. They were designed to ensure that any black person could be arrested at any time, for any reason or no reason. And once convicted, once duly convicted, to use the constitutional language, they could be leased out to private companies, farms, railroads, and mines as forced labor. For free, with no recourse, with conditions that were, by documented historical record, often worse than antebellum slavery. They didn't abolish slavery, they privatized it. And they called it the criminal justice system. Convict leasing operated across the South from roughly 1865 through the 1940s. The men subjected to it were overwhelmingly black. The crimes that sent them into the system were overwhelmingly invented. Mortality rates in some convict lease camps exceeded 40% annually. The racial disparity in American incarceration that we debate today, Black Americans incarcerated at rates more than 5 times higher than white Americans, did not emerge from nowhere. It was engineered, deliberately and methodically, beginning the moment the 13th Amendment was ratified. The 13th Amendment loophole has never been closed. Prison labor remains legal today. Several states still operate correctional industries that pay incarcerated people pennies per hour for work that generates significant revenue. The constitutional language that enabled convict leasing has never been amended. 10 laws, 10 different methods of control, 10 different ways of saying, you do not belong here, you do not have the right to vote, you do not have the right to be educated, you do not have the right to love who you love, you do not have the right to be safe, you do not have the right to exist freely in this country. And here is the uncomfortable truth we have to sit with. Most of these laws are gone, and all of their echoes remain. Black women are still being disciplined and fired for natural hairstyles in workplaces. Not everywhere, not legally, but it happens. The Tignon laws are in the history books, and their spirit is still in some HR departments. Voter ID laws, purged voter rolls, reduced polling locations in predominantly Black neighborhoods. These are the literacy tests of our era. Different mechanism, same goal. Black Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white Americans. The industries that profit from that incarceration generate billions of dollars annually. Convict leasing ended. The incentive structure that made it profitable did not. Interracial couples still face discrimination and social pressure in parts of this country. Decades after Loving versus Virginia made their marriages legal, love was decriminalized. Prejudice was not. History is not a closed book. It is an ongoing story. And we are characters in it, not just readers. The question is not whether these things happened. They did. The question is what we do with the knowledge that they happened, and that their effects are still being felt. Learn this history. Teach it. Share it. Refuse to let it stay hidden. Because a society that doesn't understand how it got here cannot choose a different direction. And perhaps most importantly, honor the people who survived these laws, who resisted them, who found loopholes in the middle of rivers and turned oppressive scarves into fashion revolutions, and traded bread for literacy lessons in secret, because they knew that knowledge was the one thing no law could permanently steal from them. They survived every one of these laws. The least we can do is remember them. Subscribe to Hidden Black Files. We're here every week with stories exactly like this one. Drop a comment below. Which of these 10 laws shocked you the most? And which one do you think still has the loudest echo today? I read every single comment. Share this video. One share keeps this history alive. We'll see you next week.